Fighting Through Podcast, episode 96. Christmas at War Around the World, 2023. More great, unpublished Christmassy. On Christmas Eve, 1944, 45 Doodlebugs were launched off the Yorkshire coast from beneath Heinkel HE-111 bombers flying over the North Sea. He scrambled up and lunged at me head first, gripping me like a wrestler, trying to make me fall. I prized him off me. He swiped at my head, missed, and grabbed me again. I pushed him off. It was a moonlit night, and as I crossed the street, a shadow passed over my head. It was a V1 bomb. I was 10 years old. Suddenly, a series of thuds vibrated through the floor, and the aircraft seemed to bank away to starboard. I leapt up from my seat to get a look at the starboard engines. They were on fire. Hello again, and another Christmas World War II welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. Corporal Chil to Kuingwa. I'll explain that later, but I've said it for listener Louis Trevitt. Put it another way, I'm Paul Chil, son of Bill Chil, whose World War II memoirs have been published by Pen and Sword in Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg. The aim of this podcast is to read family stories, memoirs and interviews with veterans in all the countries and all the forces. I dare you to listen. Today, we celebrate another Christmas at War, and indeed Hogmanay, with a Santa's sack absolutely bulging with seasonal tales of guns and goodwill, including a special feature on what Christmas was like in various countries around the globe. And just to remind you, if you want to fill your December with a catch-up on all the previous Christmas episodes for this podcast, you can access them easily by clicking on the episodes item on the website menu and selecting Christmas. And I, for one, cannot wait. It's what December is for. On with the show, and here's this week's surprise story. It's about a bomber. On December the 20th, 1943, a miracle happened in the darkest hours of World War II. Just 4 days before Christmas, two enemies, a German fighter ace and an American bomber pilot, met in the skies over Germany. What they did had not happened before or since. They decided not to kill one another. The Americans' bomber was damaged. The Germans' fighter was primed for the kill. But when the Germans' eyes met those of the American pilot, something changed in both men. Instead of destroying the bomber, the German escorted it out of Germany to safety. The two pilots parted with a salute. And then, in the late 1980s, as old men, the American and the German searched for one another, reunited, and became best friends. It's the greatest little-known story of World War II. And the story's taken from a book by Adam Makos, A Higher Call, an incredible true story of combat and chivalry in the war-torn skies of World War II. And there's a link in the show notes about all of that. For the next story, it's taken from Save the Last Bullet. It's about German boy soldier Willy Langbein Allen, and if you want to learn all the background to this, you've got to catch episode 69. But this is a story which you haven't heard before, and I've been saving it for absolutely months, if not years. This is an irresistible passage I'm going to share with you. It's short but very sweet revenge is how I'd describe it. Young Willy has been moved away from home for safety from the war. He hasn't started fighting yet. This is when he's still at school. Chapter 14, Schlecking. Willy has been staying with the family in Constance, the Volmars, but the time to move on has arrived. So Willy left Schlecking and settled in a small hotel with the rest of his school group. The passage picks up his story a few weeks later when the kids go out on a walk. One day in late February 1945, the sun finally broke through the cloud cover for the first time in 3 months, and the temperature was almost mild. We decided to go hiking to escape the feeling of having been cooped up all winter, and climbed a mountain called the Gargelstein. We took turns racing up the steep incline, enjoying our newfound freedom, with stumbles and falls along the way. The valley below us, sparsely dotted with quaint wooden cabins, still partially covered in snow, looked peaceful, like nothing bad could ever reach it. When we arrived at the top, breathless and beaming with satisfaction that we'd made it, we lay down to sunbathe. The sunshine felt pleasantly warm, despite there still being patches of snow on the ground. I must have fallen into a deep sleep for a while, because when I woke up, I was alone, and I found that some kid had removed my shoes, a pair I'd been given at Christmas. The sun was lower, and it had to be afternoon already. I stayed down at the mountain trail that I would have to brave in bare feet, and I knew I'd better get started, because it was going to take a long time, and I risked running out of daylight. Without shoes, the path was steep and treacherous. I kept slipping, and I had to grab onto rocks to catch myself, every time wincing at the pain of the sharp stones and brambles embedding themselves in my feet as I struggled for purchase, and scraping my soles in trying to secure a foothold so I wouldn't tumble down the mountain. When I finally got to the bottom, I could hardly walk any more. My feet were so raw and bloody. As I limped into the village, a kid who had been on the hike informed on the culprit, probably expecting to witness a good show when I got my hands on him. The prankster's name was Karl Hasenkalm. His parents owned a bar in Witten, close to my parents' house. "You just wait," I hissed as I passed the kid in search of Karl. The kid followed me. I found Karl walking down the street with some classmates, my shoes dangling around his neck, tied together by their shoelaces. "Hey, idiot!" I called out. "What?" he countered, stopping in the middle of the street with a swagger, trying to impress his friends. I walked up to him, adrenaline pumping so hard I didn't feel the pain in my feet. He didn't see the punch coming. I hit him so hard I knocked him off his feet, and my shoes flew off his neck onto the ground. A circle formed around us, the other kids egging us on. He scrambled up and lunged at me head first, gripping me like a wrestler, trying to make me fall. I prized him off me. He swiped at my head, missed, and grabbed me again. I pushed him off, and when he charged back, I hit him again, so hard that he flew back, fell, and this time he didn't get back up. "That's what, arsehole," I said. I picked up my shoes and walked away with a slight limp, but with my head held high, leaving him on the ground, moaning. I was pretty sure he'd think twice about having fun at my expense again. There you go. That's from Hardy Langbine's book Save the Last Bullet, episode 69, if you want more. Feedback time now, and last episode we covered the memoirs of Major Robert Metcalfe in the Green Howards at Dunkirk and more. His daughter Sue Metcalfe emailed me to say thanks for the work I did. What a heartfelt tribute to my father. You did his story justice and made his story live again. It was very touching for me personally, and he would be absolutely tickled by your podcast. Thank you so much, Sue. That's, of course, her dad's book was No Time for Dreams. And Sue continues, Dad wrote his book in 1995 when he was 80 years old and published it 2 years later. He passed in 2005 at age 90. He could still keep time to the Greenhowards Regimental March and never grew old. He did have the shrapnel in his groin surgically removed in the early 60s. He never liked being in a hospital. Perhaps too many memories. Now, what the heck? Ever on the lookout for Christmas stories? And whilst we're on the subject of Bob Metcalfe, yours truly just happened to notice a little Christmas escapade in Bob's book. I'm calling it Drinks and Trains. It's 1943 and Bob is based in Barletta in Italy. In early December 1943, the Canadian Corps, comprising 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 5th Canadian Armoured Division, were concentrating in preparation to take on the German 26th Panzer Division around Ortona. Bob was coming to the end of an assignment, and his commander, Brigadier Caldwell, said, "I'd like you to help entertain some of the nurses we're inviting to the mess back in Barletta." I saluted smartly and replied, "Yes, sir, I'll be back." Little did I realise that this marked the turning point in my life, at least domestically. I was asked to arrange a reception for the nurses of No. 1 Canadian General Hospital, who'd just arrived in Andria after a hair-raising voyage. They'd sailed from England via Algiers in North Africa, where one of the ships, carrying No. 14 CGH, was torpedoed in the Mediterranean. Their ship had stopped to rescue some of the nurses. For the reception, I took over a restaurant in Andria and arranged drinks and entrees. Due to local food shortages, our choice was restricted to Asti Spumante, the Italian champagne, at 25 cents a litre, and a food menu of octopus, local vegetables, and whatever supplies we could muster from our meagre rations in the mess. The nurses were most appreciative of their welcome, and as we were stationed within only a few miles of one another, friendships among the nurses and our HQ staff blossomed. I became very attracted to Helen Porter, a physiotherapist at the hospital. Since her duties were not as regular as the nursing sisters, she was assigned the extra duty of being in charge of supplies for the sisters' mess. She would go out with the mess sergeant, sampling and purchasing supplies for the combined messes. This included the purchase of wine, etc., which was readily available, because this was the wine country of southern Italy. Alcohol was reasonably priced in the NAFI, and Helen introduced me to a favourite drink in the sisters' mess. It was raw alcohol mixed with various fruit juices, which was known to the mess members as steam. It's a very pleasant drink, with a slow reaction that eventually hits you with devastating results. On Christmas Eve 1943, I was invited to a party at the sisters' mess. It was a terrific affair, and steam was a featured concoction. I do recall leaving the party reluctantly to return to Barletta about 2 a.m. I was driving a 1,500-weight Dodge truck, which, when not loaded, the truck, not the driver, became difficult to control and easily developed a tailspin. The road to Barletta was paved, and there was a narrow-gauge light railway running down the left-hand side. The line was used to haul wine barrels and olives from the vineyards to the processing plants in Barletta, and about halfway between Andria and Barletta, it crossed the road to the right-hand side. I don't believe I was driving at an excessive speed, but as I approached the crossing, I touched the brakes, developed a skid. It had been raining, careered across the road and came to a stop with the front wheels on the top of a low wall and my rear wheels stuck between the tracks. Couldn't go forward, couldn't go back, and couldn't care less. I decided to have a nap and await a train to get me out of my predicament. The line was straight and the speed of the trains quite slow, so I figured I was in no danger of being smashed to a pulp by a speeding locomotive. With that reassuring thought, my eyelids slammed shut. They flew open about 3 hours later at the sound of a train coming up the track, blowing its whistle like crazy. When it came to a stop, I walked down the track to meet the engineer, and in my not-so-fluent Italian told him, "If you want me out of here, you'll have to help." A chain was produced, connected between the truck and engine, and in no time we had my truck on the road. No damage done. I arrived back in Barletta in time for breakfast Christmas morning, with a light head, a huge appetite, and a new respect for the constitutions of those Canadian nurses. I was also in love. And here's another Christmas passage from Bob's book, No Time for Dreams. This is from when Bob was in Sicily in 1943. Here goes. Our main HQ was now established in Messina. This northeast area was the home of mafia families, so notorious worldwide. One day, I was travelling along the waterfront. There, over a door, I read a sign in English. This is the birthplace of Al Capone, the famous American gangster. We also had a detachment HQ on the small port of Milazzo, about 10 miles over the mountains on the north coast of the island, and I was detached from Messina HQ to work there. One of the main resources for the local economy was the growing of lemons, limes, and oranges. For many years, Mussolini had commandeered the whole crop of the island, and with the proceeds had built Tripoli in North Africa as a tourist attraction to offset the advantage that Alexandria in Egypt had produced for that economy. The Sicilians weren't too happy with this arrangement, as they felt they'd not benefited from their labour, and on the only occasion that Mussolini visited the island of Sicily, an attempt was made on his life. Arriving in Milazzo, I found the whole dock area covered with hundreds of barrels of orange and lemon peel, all earmarked for export to England. These barrels of peel had been on the docks since June 1940, this was 43, when Mussolini had declared war on Britain. In normal times, the procedure would be to roll the barrels into the sea for a period of time so that the seawater could soak the barrels. This created an acid reaction, causing the sugar to crystallise. The candied peel which resulted was then shipped to England, where it was used in the traditional English Christmas cakes. Of course, since we were at war, this profitable trade was suspended. Sicilians not being famous for a forgiving nature, I could only hope the locals wouldn't get it into their heads to target me for this situation as they had Mussolini. Louis Trevitt from Waiheke in New Zealand shared his family history with us on the last episode, and he's written in saying, "Hi Paul, I just listened to episode 95 and I noticed that you absolutely slaughtered the word Waiheke. It's pronounced Waiheke. Say it really fast also for fun. Waiheke, Waiheke, Waiheke." I don't get it, Louis. Of course, in looking all this up, I discovered that this language is Maori, and Louis cruelly taunted me further by asking, "Could you please say this on your next podcast? Kopol Toku Ingwa," which means in Maori, "My name is Paul." Well, there you go, Louis. I did it twice. I won't be attempting it a third time. There's a PS from Louis, and he says, "The troops in the desert most feared by the Germans were the 28th Maori Battalion, because they feared that if they surrendered, they would be shot." That sounds to me a bit like the fierce Gurkhas from the country of Nepal near India, who were also greatly feared by the enemy, particularly for the damage they could do with their long, curved knives, the deadly kukri. Louis, thanks for all that. I can now add Waiheke to my list of other previously mispronounced words, like lieutenant, Canberra and Melbourne, amongst many others, probably. What would I be without you kind listeners to correct my pronunciation? Probably episode 500, I guess. Thought for the day. Pronunciation only has one O in it. Think about that. I've got a great family story for you now. It's the last flight of Lancaster DV-189T2. It's about the Royal Air Force and air raids on Germany. And this features Jim Donnan, a wireless operator, submitted to the BBC People's War website by Jim's son-in-law David Kirk, many years ago, in fact. Here we go. It was New Year's Day 1944. Following 2 days of rest, we were back on operations. Our crew was on the order of battle, and for this particular trip, we were to fly in a Lancaster DV-189T2. We'd been engaged in routine pre-operational checks and testing of our equipment prior to the main briefing, which commenced in a tense atmosphere. When the curtain was drawn aside, exposing the operational map, the target was Berlin for the third consecutive time. Only this time, our route to the big city was almost direct from the Dutch coast, across an area which was becoming increasingly dangerous because of night fighter activity. Deteriorating weather conditions delayed our takeoff for several hours. It was therefore difficult to relax during this period. We joined 550 Squadron on its formation at Waltham in Grimsby on the 25th of November 1943, having transferred from 12 Squadron at Wickenby, where we'd flown on operations from the 3rd of September until the end of November. Our last 3 operations there had also taken us to Berlin. As New Year's Day was drawing to a close, we were preparing for takeoff, and at 14 minutes past midnight, we were airborne and on our way at last. The sky was dark and overcast as we flew through layers of broken cloud, climbing to our operational height, heading east over the North Sea. As we approached the Dutch coast, we could see that the anti-aircraft defences were very active, and we became alert to the dangers ahead. Flying over Germany, there were occasional bursts of flak, and flashes lit up the thick, unbroken cloud along the route. While searching the night fighter waveband, I was aware of considerable activity by the German control. We found it necessary to keep a sharp lookout, even though our trip had been uneventful so far. Our navigator called for a slight change in course for the final leg to Berlin as we reached a position between Hanover and Bremen. It was almost immediately afterwards that a series of thuds vibrated through the floor, and the aircraft seemed to bank away to starboard. I leapt up from my seat to the Astrodome, where I could see the starboard engines were on fire. As I switched over from radio to intercom, I saw that a fire had started under the navigator's table, on the floor just behind the pilot. It was soon burning fiercely. The pilot gave the order to abandon the aircraft. I clipped on my parachute, and as I moved forward, it was found that the front escape hatch would not open. The engineer joined the bomb aimer in trying to release it. As I stood behind the navigator, waiting to exit, the rear gunner said that he was having trouble with the rear turret. I then signalled that I would go to the rear exit. The navigator was standing beside the pilot ready to exit as I scrambled over the main spar and along the fuselage to the rear door, losing my shoes on the way. When I got there, the mid-upper gunner was ready to leave, and the rear gunner was out of his turret and preparing to come forward. I then jettisoned the rear door as the flames from the starboard wing streamed past, licking the tailplane. Grasping the release handle on my parachute, I was preparing to jump, but I must have lost consciousness as I have no recollection of what happened next or how I left the plane. When I regained consciousness, my parachute was already open, and I was floating in pitch darkness, very cold, and my feet were freezing. I seemed to be a long time coming down, but as I descended through the clouds, dark shadows appeared, and I landed on soft ground in an open space. Gathering up my parachute, I dashed over to a clump of trees where I sat on the ground shivering and wondering how I could avoid capture. I removed all the identification from my battle dress, put padding from my Mae West inside my socks, and after disposing of my unwanted equipment, I set off walking to get away from the area where I'd landed. The ground was very soft and wet, and there was no sound of any activity in the area. It was still dark, and I appeared to be going round in circles. Snow had been falling for a while, and I was very wet and cold. I then stumbled across a tool shed, where I was able to shelter and found a pair of wooden clogs. When daylight came, I could see that the shed was at the side of a track which ran through a peat cutting area with blocks of peat stacked along the side. I ventured out, keeping to the countryside and away from the roads. I was very thirsty and decided to look for a more populated area where I could get help. I made my way along a narrow country road until I could see what looked like farm buildings in the distance. I made my way towards the buildings, and although the area appeared to be inhabited, there was no one about. I rested in a cowshed until evening. I really knew that I could not go on without help. My feet and legs were swollen, and the clogs were useless. As there did not appear to be anyone about, I decided to go out in search of food and drink. I'd not gone far when I was challenged by a man who came out and said something that I did not understand. I indicated that I wanted something to drink. I was taken into a kitchen and given food and drink. Various people came and asked me questions that I could not understand, so I did not try to answer. After some time there, I was taken to a coffee house and given a glass of beer whilst further discussion took place between the people there. Soon afterwards, a lady came in and spoke to me in English. I couldn't take in what she was saying, but I replied, "Oh, you speak English." She then told me that she thought that I was a British airman and asked me why I had not got any shoes on. She said that someone would come to see me. It was not long after that when 2 men in uniform arrived and I was taken into custody. The following day, I was interviewed by a Luftwaffe officer at the nearby Flugplatz airbase. He told me who I was and asked me where I'd been since the crash. He asked me if I'd like to know about my comrades, saying that they'd all been accounted for, but 2 had been killed in the crash. It was then that I found that the engineer and bomb aimer were with me at the same Flugplatz. They were able to assist me when we were taken under armed guard by train to Dulac Luft at Frankfurt, where we met up with our 2 air gunners. After spending several days there, we were transported by rail in cattle trucks to Stalag 4B at Mühlberg, Elbe, where we remained until the end of the war. In May 1990, I met Dick Friedrich, who was very interested in researching aircraft crash sites between 1940 and 45 in Holland. Dick very kindly volunteered to help locate where my aircraft had crashed in Germany, and after very thorough and painstaking research, he established that the aircraft had crashed between the villages of Schweringen and Holtrop near Bremen. He'd communicated with many local historians and people in the area, and as a result of his investigations, an article was published in the local German newspaper Die Harke, of which the following are translated extracts. Friedrich Deicher. The bomber crash in January 1944 almost became a catastrophe for Schweringen. In the middle 40s, hundreds of 4-engined Lancaster bombers flew over the territory of Nienburg to transport their deadly cargo towards Berlin and other cities. Not just a few were attacked by German fighters and shot down. It happened to the 7 crew members of a Lancaster that started out a few minutes after the end of New Year's Day 1944 from Waltham, Grimsby, and belonged to 550 Squadron. 2.5 hours later, it was shot down near Nienburg by a night fighter. 2 crew members were killed, 5 bailed out by parachute. Friedrich Deicher and Heinrich Eichhoff were in 1944 only 15 and 16 years old. They haven't forgotten that New Year's evening of 1944 ever. There was an air raid alarm, and Eichhoff had just returned home from a party in Sebenhausen. It was a soggy, cold night when the sirens started to shriek. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion like I've never heard, he says. Outside, it was as clear as day, and there was fire everywhere. In the cellar, the preserves fell from the shelves. Immediately, the word spread around that a bomber had crashed and exploded, and some airmen had bailed out by parachute. Friedrich says that when his father looked out, he suddenly stared at a sea of fire. The deafening explosion blew open doors, plaster fell from the walls, windows shattered, and roofs were ripped off. Friedrich added, the bomber was blown into thousands of pieces. The 4 motors were found hundreds of metres away in a field near Schweringen. The crash place was turned into a deep crater. Heinrich is now the Bürgermeister of Holtrop and Schweringen, where he was born. He states, I can vividly remember the day the British bomber crashed. It crashed with its complete bomb load, causing a huge crater, with wreckage parts scattered over a wide area. As a curious 14-year-old boy, I arrived at the crater before the area was sealed off. A local military unit came and searched the area for bodies, which were put in a coffin. 3 men were taken prisoner in the area. We didn't know that there were 7 crew. Jim Donnan picks up again. Thanks to Dick's fantastic work, I was able to return to the area on the 2nd of January 1994, the 50th anniversary of our crash. Our purpose was to visit the graves of my 2 comrades in Hanover War Cemetery and also the crash area where they died. On Monday the 3rd, we were met in Holtrop by the Bürgermeister, Heinrich Bochmann, Friedrich Deicher and Wilhelm Meyer. We then proceeded to the crash site in Holtrop, where a reporter from the newspaper Die Harke greeted us and took a keen interest in the event that had happened 50 years ago. The crash of the Lancaster and the explosion of the bomb load could have been a major disaster for Holtrup or Schweringen, but it took place between them. When we left the site of the crash, we were taken to the coffee house in Holtrup, where we were introduced to Annie Hupper, who's now 82. She was the lady who came to the coffee house when I was taken there after being captured because she could speak English. She was very pleased to find that I was now wearing shoes. Everybody was very helpful and friendly, and we had a most enjoyable time. During the next day, we were shown around the local area where the crew had come down by parachute, and the locations where some had been captured. Before leaving the area, we visited the churchyards at Hassel and Hoyer, where our pilot and navigator were first buried before being transferred to the war cemetery at Hanover. The following day, we visited the crash site of another Lancaster that came down the same night as ours, killing 6 of the crew. We went to the war cemetery the next morning and saw the graves of F.O. Bryson and Sergeant Roxby, where I laid a wreath in their memory on behalf of the surviving crew members and 550 Squadron. And the following is an extract from my son-in-law's diary. I was very moved by the number of graves of such young men and paid particular attention to the memory of those who'd fallen 50 years ago. The inscription on one young man's grave seemed to embrace the whole sorrowful but pleasantly kept site. In memory of a loving son who gave his life so that England may remain free. Your duty now done, you can rest in peace. Love, Mum and Dad. This and other equally moving epitaphs reminded me of how lucky and grateful I was. I've got a couple of shout-outs now. Will Killigan from just outside of Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia. It's the home of the US Army Infantry and recently Armour School too. Lots of history and a great museum. Craig Lines from RAF Barford St John in the UK says, "Hi Paul, thank you for making such a brilliant podcast. I was hooked earlier this year from the first episode and I've binged on it since whilst sat driving my tractor through harvest. Sadly, unless I'm alone in the tractor, then I can't listen to the podcast as I'll only miss bits and I don't want to do that. Thanks to Spotify Unwrapped, they've told me how much I've listened to you talking. And wow, it shocked me, a whole 84 hours of listening up to episode 67. Craig continues, I have a close relationship with an airfield that had the test flights of the Gloucester E-2839 jet aircraft. Close enough that I drive up and down the runways every day in the winter when out shepherding. It's got a strange feeling up there for sure, and I'm proud of its history. It was a flying school to start with, I believe, then housed Wellingtons and the Gloucester. In my area, there are vast airfields and MOD bases. You once mentioned RAF Bicester. That's only up the road, as is RAF Croughton. Upper Hayford, Bryce Norton, Enstone, Shennington, Edge Hill, which also had the Gloucester fly from it. That's just to name a few. Craig, thanks so much for that. Are you impressed that I pronounced Bicester correctly and not Bicester? I reckon if you're ever tired of the tractor, Craig, you could easily convert to tour guide around all those such historic places. Amazing stuff. Going on to Adrian Pincus. Adrian describes himself as a tragic listener. He says, I'm listening while I'm working night shift. I'm from Sydney, Australia. I relic detect during my days off. I detect around old army bases, finding buttons, badges and buckles, and even coins, plus lots of training rounds. One of my best finds is an Australian badge that they wore on their lapels during World War I. Just thought I would share. Keep up with the great episodes. And Adrian sent me a few pics of his relics, and I've put them in the show notes. And Adrian continues, "It's a great feeling knowing that one of our diggers had used these at one point in time while he was training and then sent overseas to fight. The bullets are a standard round, and the one with a point, the round one, is a dum-dum round. The Aussie digger used them during the Anzac campaign in Gallipoli. The dum-dum rounds were later banned as they caused too much damage. Cheers, Paul. I'm listening to your podcast while writing this." Oh, Adrian, thank you for that. Good man. I've got a few quick-fire family comments and stories, etc. now. This one's by NoDesk582, whatever that means. "My great-grandfather was Italian. Before World War II, he went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, 29th of December. He returned to Italy on the 9th of June 1939. Then 3 months later, he went to fight in Africa because of World War II. Unfortunately for him, sometime in 1941, I think, he got captured by the British and was put into a POW camp in Britain, Eastling, Southampton. He wasn't released until the 22nd of March 1946, so that's like 5 years as a POW. After he returned to Italy, he decided to move back to England, where he lived until his death sometime in the early 2000s. Thank you, NoDesk582. That is so poignant. And what sort of message do we get there about looking after your prisoners and taking care of them as you'd like to be looked after yourselves? This is a story by Patrick Dickinson on the BBC People's War website. It's about prisoner of war parcels, and no doubt many of these parcels were sent out and received by grateful prisoners over the Christmas period. It reads as follows: Grand Avenue, which leads down to the seafront at Hove on the Sussex coast, is now almost entirely made up of large blocks of luxury flats. In the 1940s, however, it boasted of some of the most expensive private houses in Brighton and Hove. This is the UK, obviously. One of these was taken over early in the war by the British Red Cross and became a centre for the packing of POW parcels. These were then handed over to the International Red Cross for distribution to prisoner of war camps all over Europe. At the age of 10, in 1943, I became involved in this work during school holidays. Another boy called Henry and myself were approached by one of his neighbours whose husband was in a POW camp in Germany. She was a volunteer parcel packer with the Red Cross and said they were so very short-staffed and needed help with the fetching and carrying, so as to free up the more experienced ladies to do the actual packing. So for 2 hours, 2 mornings a week, that is what we did. The rooms on the ground floor of the house were filled with long trestle tables at which the packers, many in the WVS, Women's Voluntary Service, sat with a sack of straw, or maybe raffia, between them. The contents of the food parcels, tins of fruit, bars of chocolate and packets of dried fruit, etc., were stored in the basement. These had to be brought up on trolleys in a lift, one of the main attractions of the job as far as Henry and I were concerned, and taken round to the packers at their tables, together with flat-pack cardboard boxes. As each box was filled to a regulation formula, it had to be carried by Henry or me and stacked in an adjacent room, and that was the last we saw of them. I wonder if there are any other survivors left who were engaged in this branch of war work. Somewhere, too, in the archives of the British Red Cross, presumably there are statistical records of the parcels and their contents sent to prisoner of war camps throughout Europe. What a nice story. That reminds me of a time years ago when I was a half-responsible senior schoolboy. I did a temporary job working for the post office during the school holidays over the lead up to Christmas, and I can remember several times delivering to an office on this bleak industrial estate, delivering through rain, hail and mud, feet rubbed raw, gangrene nearly setting in. You get the picture. I thought the girls working there had taken a shine to me when one morning they asked me if I'd be working the following day. The implication was that sherry and mince pies were going to be on offer, and I looked forward to it. I arrived the next day with the post and a spring in my step to find that the office had closed for Christmas. I can't repeat the language I used under my breath, but it wasn't pretty. I did put the mail in the letterbox, but if I'd really thought about it, I would have stuck it somewhere else. Ideas through the contents section of the website, please. I'm not sure if CCTV was common in those days, but either way, I bet those girls had a real laugh at my expense. Mark Wright Johnson from Santa Fe in New Mexico has written in, "Hi Paul, I was off camping with my daughter and I had Thunder Below as an audiobook. Here are some passages for you to cut and paste the story as you feel is best. All the best, Mark." And this is a Christmas story from Eugene Flucky's book Thunder Below about the USS Barb submarine. There's a link in the show notes. And before I run with the story, I'll just share a little bit of background that I've looked up about Eugene Flucky. According to Wikipedia, Eugene Bennett Flucky, nicknamed Lucky Flucky, God, you've got to make sure you say that one right, was a United States Navy Rear Admiral who received the Medal of Honor and 4 Navy Crosses during his service as a submarine commander in World War II. Flucky's war record included 16 ships sunk for over 95,000 tons, the most of any US submarine captain in history. And USS Barb is famous as a handful of crew members invaded Japan long enough to place one of the scuttling charges on a railroad bridge with a micro switch. And if you look at their battle flag, you'll see a train among the ship's silhouettes, and it does indeed. Here we go. This is knocked up from Mark's notes. On Christmas morning, the crew's mess was filled with jovial breakfasters. Breakfast included hot cross buns using a recipe from the wife of a sailor. Someone had drawn a Christmas tree on the back of a chart and hung it on the back of a bulkhead in the crew's mess. Others joined in and drew ornaments. The captain had received what looked like a phonograph record and a number of other packages from parents to slip under the tree. He carefully unwrapped the record and played it without introduction. Soon, the mess was saturated with the angelic soprano voice of a child singing Silent Night, and it came upon a midnight clear. It had been recorded for the crew by the baby sister of a crew member, Glenn, who put his cup down and cocked his head. "It's Eva Jewell, my little sister, singing." Glenn listened with undivided attention, unashamed of the tears moistening his cheeks. All round thunderous applause followed. The captain then read an accompanying letter. "This precious jewel is for all in the USS Barb." There's photos in the show notes of the flag and the crew, and maybe one of them is Glenn, whose little sister's sweet singing, for a moment, brought those brave sailors to tears one Christmas day. A contribution that came in some time ago now from Lisa Loftus from Missouri, and Lisa says, "I'm reading The Christmas Truce." We've all heard of that book, I should think. This quote is from Private John Diamond, 2nd Battalion, Devonshire Regiment. When in the trenches, it was up to our knees in mud and water, and very cold, but we didn't mind. We knew we'd got to do it, so we stuck it with a joke and a smile. And Lisa adds, I need that attitude come Monday mornings. And another funny line from the same book. It's strange how used we've become. Used to the noise of the big guns. During our periods of repose, we're more easily wakened by the yelping of the farmyard watchdog than by the sound of artillery. It is generally thought that the dog will have an accident shortly. Thank you, Lisa. Oh, something's coming. Ian Burgess from Bury in Greater Manchester has built a brilliant website called aircrashsites.co.uk. It's got history, photographs, a forum, some great content about wartime air crash sites. The sound you've just heard was the arrival and explosion of a V1 bomb, fondly known as a Doodlebug, or also a buzz bomb, as mentioned by Claude Reynolds when we spoke to him. After the air raids of 1940 and 41, the north of England saw little of the Luftwaffe following Hitler's decision to go to war with the Soviet Union. German bombers were pulled back from attacking British cities, and while V1 flying bombs and V2 rockets fell on London and the southeast, they could not get as far north as Manchester from the launch ramps in occupied Europe. However, on Christmas Eve 1944, 45 Doodlebugs were launched off the Yorkshire coast from beneath Heinkel HE-111 bombers flying over the North Sea. The bombers released the V1s, aimed at Manchester, then turned back to base. Many of the missiles landed harmlessly. The worst was at Abbey Hills Road in Oldham, where 27 people were killed. And this attack on Manchester is the subject of this episode. The V1s were launched between 0500 and 0600 on the morning of Christmas Eve 1944. It took about 30 minutes from launch to the missiles falling to Earth. Typically, buildings were damaged up to a mile away. The missiles couldn't be guided with accuracy, hence they came down in fields, on the moors, as well as in the towns. Sometimes they'd turn round or spiral down. A few of the Doodlebugs were well off target, one landing near Chester, one as far north as County Durham, while another came down at Woodford in Northamptonshire, so some distance apart. The intention was to strike terror among British civilians as revenge for what the Allied air forces were doing to German civilians. One of the attacking Heinkel 111s was shot down over the North Sea by Mosquito TA-389, while another was damaged by another Mosquito and crash-landed at Lech in Germany, killing one of the crew. From the numerous testimonies beneath the photos on the website from people who were there, it's clear that although V1s were unheard of in the north of England, people quickly recognised the telltale sound of the Argus pulse jet engine from having seen newsreels of V1 attacks on London. Consequently, they reacted quickly, getting children to hide under their beds. V1s were in use from the summer of 1944, although the majority were launched from ramps in occupied Europe and aimed at London. Over 1,000 were air-launched from beneath the bombers over the North Sea. V1s were over 27 feet long, with a wingspan of over 17 feet, and they carried an 850-kilogram warhead and flew at about 400 miles an hour. Had V1s been in use earlier in the war, the outcome may have been very different. They were cheap, involved no risk to Luftwaffe personnel, put RAF fighters on the defensive, and caused massive damage when they hit built-up areas, as well as affecting the morale of British civilians. V1s were the first cruise missiles. There wasn't much in the way of a guidance system. A basic autopilot kept the flying bomb stable, using the rudder to steer rather than the weapon needing to bank. A propeller on the nose counted down to the intended target area, at which point the weapon would be put into a steep dive. This caused the fuel flow to be cut, meaning people on the ground knew that if the overhead V1 suddenly went quiet, it was about to impact. The Luftwaffe got round this flaw, and later models went into a powered dive with no warning. Sometimes propaganda leaflets, mini copies of Signal magazine, and POW letters were stashed in canisters in the missile. As the engine cut, the canisters were ejected, and the Germans hoped the material would be picked up by British civilians. Many did so out of curiosity. The letters were genuine, and the idea of these letters was that someone would pick them up and would eventually make its way to the relative, whereupon the person would write to their relative in a POW camp, and the Germans would then know where the letter was found, and thus where their missile fell. It was a long shot, really, depending on the letter getting to the relative, and then the relative obligingly telling the German censor how they came about it. Here's an example, and this is from Leslie Swift, from an address in Maidstone, Kent, and this is November the 11th, 44. My dearest, darling mother and father, my thoughts are forever of you and this day of remembrance. I write you these cheering words, knowing you will both have the respects for me and enjoy yourselves who be level-headed. I'm a soldier and must expect these hardships that are bestowed upon us, but we must not be downhearted, or it's not playing the trump card. I'm making the best of a good hiding, so to speak, and am now getting along very nicely and hope to get a nice parcel from you some time or other. On my return to England after the war, we'll have an excellent drink and laughter and joy. Also, let me say the Germans are very much like us as regards to our ways, and I have become friendly with quite a few. They are not what the paper reads. It's difficult to tell the difference in ways and manner. Also, I say again, you must not worry. I am well and have good health and warm clothing, good bed with sheets, and your photographs at my side. What more can one wish for? We work and are paid. Well, my dearest ones, happy Christmas, and Dad, don't drink all that glorious beer, and Mother, don't forget the plum cake. So, dearest ones, cheerio for now. Lots of love, Leslie. Now, it's interesting reading through that because some of the phraseology isn't really perfect English, and I think some of that was concocted by the Germans, maybe telling the prisoner what he had to write. But nonetheless, you get the drift of what was being done. One or two stories coming out on the website forum now. Someone called Bill has said, my dad and his brother were blown over by a V1 landing in Bethnal Green, London. They were bowled over but otherwise unharmed. And Ian, the site host, has said Bethnal Green tube station, as you'll probably know, Bill, was the scene of a dreadful civilian disaster when people panicked and surged forward while seeking shelter during an air raid. McLaren says, on Christmas Eve 1944 at Beswick in Manchester, my family was in a street air shelter during an air raid alert. I was sent to return an empty cocoa jug to our home a few yards away. It was a moonlit night, and as I crossed the street, a shadow passed over my head. It was a V1 bomb gliding silently to its doom. I was 10 years old. Elephant says, my great-aunt was in the raid on Oldham. I was born on a street 2 away from Abbey Hills, and my mother often talked about the raid. I remember there were new houses in the gap where the Doodlebug had dropped, which looked very strange. The raid was designed to destroy Manchester. Kevin Regan adds, Christmas Eve 44, our farm at Scamandon had no gas, electricity or water supply. There were the wells and rivers. The searchlights were the only glow, piercing the sky on a distant horizon. The bombers were occasionally illuminated like dancing fish. A dance macabre, a fishbowl flying into the ground as the ack-ack pierced their armour. As time passed, they perfected intercontinental rocketry, indeed interworld rocket science to be sure. Pitch black, the moors make only a sound of absolute silence, clean, clear, unspoilt. They launched their vengeful weapons from the undercarriage, released when near the Yorkshire coast. 5 ballistic missiles flew overhead. I fell into the grass and froze. What on God's earth is this witchcraft? Fire in the sky. Manchester must be the target. The end of days? Jeremy Sullivan said, my mother passed away a few years ago, and I've recently been sorting out her old PC. Over the years, she often spoke about her WRAF days during the war, and below I found a couple of her accounts of 24th of December 1944. Listener, I bet you didn't expect this one coming up. I didn't either. I have included these two as there seems to be a slight contradiction as to the amount of V1 splitting on her radar screen. I guess old age might have something to do with her recollection. And this is the first account. The 1944 early morning raid on 24th of December I remember well. I was a radar operator on night duty at RAF Stenigot and was the first person to pick up the incoming raiders on the cathode ray tube in front of me. They were about 100 miles distant and coming almost directly towards our station. Filter room had nothing on their table and asked if the signals could be birds. As the range shortened, other stations along the coast began to report and panic set in. At about 50 miles, I reported that they looked like V1s when each track split into 3, with one starting to retreat and the other 2 coming on toward the coast. They were then identified as hostile. Once they crossed the coast, the ROC, the Royal Observation Corps, were plotting them. But as some of them were heading our way, a couple of people went out and saw 2 of them, one almost overhead. In 1944, radar was still very secret, so no mention of our part was ever made public at that time. And here's the second account. Today is my 83rd birthday, so my memory is obviously not what it was, but I recall events in the distant past in greater detail than something which happened last week. Yeah, don't we all? I was stationed at RAF Stennygot, a radar station inland of Louth, Lincolnshire, on 6 weeks' loan from RAF Stoke Holy Cross near Norwich, where I'd been involved in trying to plot V2s. 4 senior leading aircraft women, LACWs, were loaned to Stennygot, 1 to each watch, as extra help for senior NCOs newly arrived back in this country after years overseas and who had no experience of the latest equipment. On the night of 23rd, 24th of December, I was on the night watch, i.e. 11 p.m. on the 23rd to 8 a.m. the next morning. There was little or no activity, as I recall, and none expected. I can't remember how many people were on watch, possibly 8 or 9, certainly no more. It was usual practice to have an hour each on the various positions which had to be manned. Some could be doubled up at very slack times, as on this occasion. After an hour on the tub, i.e. looking at the screen, the cathode ray tube, for signs of aircraft activity, the following hour was free. My turn came at, I think, 2 p.m. Some of the girls were making paper decorations for the Christmas entertainment, and we were chatting idly to keep alert. Now this is where my story gets a little technical. The CH stations had a B system, the gap filler, with aerials set at different heights to the main ones. This occasionally picked up aircraft that were not visible or were very faint on the main receiver. It was accepted practice to go over to this gap system every 10 minutes just to see if there was anything else on it. Sometime after taking over, I don't recall how long, I idly pressed the B button and saw to my great surprise numerous echoes at, say, 80 miles or so, heading towards the coast. Immediately I asked Filter Room if they had any activity on the table. No, they said, with the usual question, "Are you sure it's not birds?" By this time, the echoes had come in around 50 miles from our coastline, and as I was watching, each echo suddenly started to split into 2. One started to retreat, while the other one continued towards us. At this point, I told Filter Room that they looked like V1s to me, having seen them once before at a previous station. Listener, obviously, this is a Heinkel 111 bomber releasing its V1. The V1 carries on towards the country and the bomber turns back, and that's why they seem to be splitting. Anyway, carrying on. By now, other stations had got them on their screens. The CHLs would have good sightings. Filter Room was in a panic, and we had to ring down to camp to get our technical officer to come up to the operational site. At least 2 of the flying bombs passed over us. One quite close, according to a couple of people who went outside to look for them. I had exceeded my 1-hour stint in front of the screen, but was asked to stay on until all the plots had crossed the coast. From what I remember, the V1s must have crossed the coast over quite a wide area, as they were very well spaced out. Of course, we soon started to plot our own fighters, going after the German raiders. From the plots which we passed to the Filter Room, I was asked to try and draw a map of the tracks before going off duty. I had never seen this done before and did not see it done again, but we just did as asked in those days without question. After a night watch, most stations did the 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. that same evening. Hence, I was on watch that night, Christmas Eve 1944. Needless to say, there was a full watch instead of the skeleton watch, which would have been the norm. We were not given much information, and I thought Nottingham was as far as any V1 had reached. I believe the station received a "good work" message of acknowledgement, But I guess we soon forgot all about the event as just another episode in daily life. It was what we called a bind for a while, having a full watch with a tech officer on duty and not much flying. It did not register with me as a special event at the time, and it is only in much later years that I've learned the full story, even though I can say that I was the first person to have picked up the V1s on that fateful night. I was surprised to learn very recently that one flying bomb had reached the outskirts of Chester, where I have lived for many years. Listener, there are too many other stories to mention on this website. Full link in the show notes, and I'd recommend it for all there is to know about the Doodlebugs, and there are loads of stories from people who experienced them. I think that deserves a Christmas wow. And Ian, thank you for all your efforts in keeping this website created and up to date. That's aircrashsites.co.uk. Time for the Christmas Around the World feature. I've been trawling Reddit, the columns of Reddit, for Christmas stories at war, and this is different countries, different stories in no particular order of importance. This one's Christmas at Colditz. Growing up, I lived in the UK for 4 years. This is American DJ Jedi Jeff. One year at Christmas, one of our family gifts, Santa brought gifts for individuals as well as the family, was a board game called Escape from Colditz. It's about prisoners of war trying to escape from a German castle that was used as a POW camp, with some daring escape attempts being true stories. We then later met a local person that had been held captive there. It was so wild to be playing a game about escaping from a POW camp and then to meet one of the actual POWs. That's DJ Jedi Jeff on Reddit. Thank you, Jeff. Now a story from the UK. My great-grandmother lived through World War I and II. She lived on the edge of Liverpool, which was heavily bombed in World War II. She was pregnant with my great-uncle and my nan during the war and had to give birth to both of them in a house that had windows blown out by bombs. Christmas, from what she told me, was very, very cold, and having so many family members and no money, they hardly got any presents. During the First World War, when my great-granny was a teen, they all had to work in place of their father, who'd gone to war. The whole family, which included young children, saved up enough money by working in factories and farms to have a goose for dinner, and that's it. They also went to church. In World War II, when my granny was married, she had enough money to get one toy for her eldest son, and the babies didn't get anything. They still went to church though, and they had loads of family around to make Christmas bearable. There were so many living in the house that many of them had to sleep on the floor, and they had no Christmas tree. I don't know how they all got by in a tiny house with more than 10 people living in it, and no windows in the middle of winter. Must have been absolutely freezing. And that's from Mrs. Pygmy Piggy. Over to Italy now. Poor farmers my family were, and poor farmers they kept being. There's nothing interesting to say about Christmas during the World Wars. Food might have been the same as that eaten the rest of the year. Generally soups and vegetables, and if they had access to it, they'd probably have eaten a little more meat than usual, a luxury for many at the time, with what little sweets they could find or make. There wasn't much of a difference between the already low quantity of foods available in Italy since the 1930s up to 1940. and the wartime rationing. Something that didn't change though was going to Mass, as it was still attended with the whole family. And that's from the Commentary King. Ireland. 3/4 of my grandparents lived in stone huts, barely fit for habitation, with no light or heat, except that which a fire could produce, and no running water, something that persisted even while my parents were kids. They dressed in their best clothes and went to Mass, dealt with the animals, and then they did what all impoverished Irish families did for entertainment. They told stories. If there was alcohol, the adults would drink some. My grandmother's family were particularly well off, and I remember her mentioning that they would listen to the radio. The first year after the war, she got a banana in her Christmas stocking, and it was the first one she'd ever seen. I think my mother's parents would have fish for Christmas dinner because it was a holy day. Darth Vader. Hungary now. It was the time when the heavy fighting in the siege of Budapest started. I heard stories about stolen property and a dead newborn. Obviously, a lot of changes were made to traditions, including scavenging for horse meat. That's Tudor-Apo. In the Netherlands, what they did was to try to survive, just like in the rest of the war. We were relatively lucky. We were liberated in September of 1944 by the Polish, the best guys you could get to liberate you, and the part where my grandparents lived was handed over without that much of a fight. Some 30 kilometres to the west, there was really heavy fighting, since that was the area that controlled the entrance to the Vestelscheld, and thus the access to the port of Antwerp. Not to mention that food was scarce in most of the country. In the countryside, it wasn't as bad as in the big cities, but it was still pretty bad. Straven. Spain. My grandparents were really poor during World War II. There was civil war and dictatorship in Spain, to the point of living in a one-room house, so they couldn't really celebrate Christmas. The only thing my grandma told me about it was that the best Christmas present she received as a child was an apple. Arilla. Finland. Can't imagine it to have been too great. For all my great-grandfathers, they spent Christmas in a trench or in a hut inside the trench. They did this for 5 Christmases. The ones who lived until the end did anyway. Their families likely had a normal Christmas for that time, with rationing of course. Ice climbers. Germany. I can say that Christmas was very unhappy in Germany, especially in World War I, because many rations were going to the front. World War I had one winter that was so rough that it was called the Rubenwinter, or carrot winter, roughly translated, because many lived on mostly carrots then. Schatzmeister. Sweden. Well, Christmas during World War I know what my gran on my mother's side had. She used to have nuts and candies and a bowl of fine porridge and nice dinner. But her father died due to being forced to patrol a town in northern Sweden in thin wool uniform, and his lungs couldn't handle the cold. He had a warm sheepskin coat at home. He wasn't allowed to use it. At home, if their cow, a house cow as many had without being farmers, still gave milk, then a thick porridge made with pearl barley and milk. My great-gran prided herself that at Christmas Eve they'd go to bed with a full belly. In World War II, my grandfather had Christmas pike with potatoes and some type of veggies, and for dessert, sugar pears. Pears were free, and they'd been preserved in the autumn. The pike wasn't part of rationing, and he'd spend his free time 2 weeks before Christmas trying to catch it, then pack it in snow to preserve it. It sometimes came alive when thawed out. This was standard food for Christmas, because they weren't rich but not poor. They were sort of lower middle class, Gran and Grandad. Both worked at the local paper mill, but they always had family over, and I know everyone brought something. I know my maternal side lived in Stockholm during World War II and could get better food, and I know they and the neighbour helped each other out, and both grandparents were hard on sharing what they could, because they both knew how it was to go to bed hungry. They'd gone from poverty to upper middle class. Cake fool. This is another one from the Netherlands. I remember a story from my grandfather that as a working class Catholic family from Amsterdam, they would have midnight mass and do their annual confessions. But all street lights had to be turned off to prevent air raids, so walking back they could barely see anything. My grandfather tripped over something, and according to Grandpa, he cursed and sweared so hard he had to walk right back to confess again. That's from sub NL 96. Italy again. My grandma's family, all the village actually, suffered from the war only around the end, when Italy was split between the Italian Social Republic and the Kingdom of Italy, who just betrayed the Axis. Thus, because her village was very close to the front, and so the Germans used the village as a base, everyone had to donate food to them and anything else they needed. She said unjustified violence never happened, but they did kill some suspect partisans. My other grandma had to host firstly a group of German soldiers, and some months later Americans. That's from Powerful Source. France. I think my family had it pretty good and didn't need to make a lot of changes during the war, since they were all pretty wealthy back then. One side of my family used to own a shoe factory, and on the other side they were collaborators with the Germans, which I'm not proud of, so they probably got more rations than the average population. NB Fox. Another one from Finland. For my grandparents, it was either the front line or at home with complete light discipline to deny Soviet bombers any easy targets or landmarks. Any imported products such as tobacco, coffee, flavoured booze and fruits were rationed. Domestic products such as sugar, meat, flour, milk, eggs and butter were also rationed. Coffee was either cut entirely or substituted with, for instance, roasted barley or chicory and dandelion root. Booze was distilled from wood pulp byproducts from the forest industry. They didn't have much, but they did have each other. And that's from Mental Repairs. So, after all these posts on Reddit, an American guy wades in and adds, "Man, these guys manage smiles even though it was such an awful time, while I'm sitting here with a long face on, moping that the remote is too far to reach. It's all reinforced some resolutions I've decided to make next year. Every time I see colorized images, it just reminds me of how young these guys are. It's just mind-blowing to me that these guys are 21 years old or less and going off to a world war." I'll try and raise the mood again now. After all those slightly sad stories, Frank Papalia has written this next story in from his son James's new book, where he continues his mysterious leap into the world of wars past. It's a Christmas story in which James and his friends split up and end up in different places and witness different aspects of the war. A couple of his friends are going to be in a home where their two sons are off to war and see how it affects them. His sisters are on a ship where they meet their grandpa Joe as he spends Christmas island hopping. Frank says that James thinks that this is a cool story and better than just the horrors of war. It puts a nice human touch on it and highlights humanity in the face of unspeakable sadness and horrors. What more could we ask for? So this is Christmas at War by James Papalia. I woke up in a barracks. It was Christmas Day. I smelled turkey being cooked and Christmas trees. I heard bells jingling and Christmas carols being sung. I saw snow-covered grounds, fireplaces roaring, and a bunch of British soldiers standing guard, smiling and singing. I noticed one I've seen before in some of my adventures. It was Bill Cheel, father of my friend Paul Cheel. I walked over to Bill and I said, "Hi Bill, do you remember me from Dunkirk, 1940? Bill said to me, "Son, what are you doing here?" I said to him, "I don't know, but what's going on?" Bill and I talked a little bit and then he told me what he was doing. My company is throwing a Christmas party for poor German children that have nowhere else to go. I said to him, "After all that time fighting and risking your life, you'd still do that for German kids?" Bill was very proud and said it was nice to celebrate a Christmas without war and that they were really happy to give those kids some cheerfulness, and we felt cheerful ourselves. Bill was injured in the war and was moved from his greenhouses to a guard post in occupied Germany. I asked him when he could go see his family. He said, "Hopefully soon. I miss them and my home a lot." I realised it was very tough on him to be far away from home on Christmas, but was very proud of him for helping those poor German kids. Bill had fought from Dunkirk to Hamburg. Nice plug for the book, James. And was now serving Christmas joy and humanity to his former rivals and giving German children who'd also suffered a very Merry Christmas. While I was with Bill, my sisters Ava and Emily ended up on a ship in Japan. They were very scared, but were relieved when they heard men singing Christmas songs and eating cookies sent to the men from a base that had arrived that day. They knew a face from pictures and decided to join him. "Grandpa Joe?" they asked. The young Marine looked puzzled. "I am Joe, but not Grandpa Joe." Ava asked for a bite of his cookie. Emily was just scared. Joe Dimacheli said, "What are you kids doing here?" Ava said she didn't know, but wanted to have some of the cookies. Grandpa Joe said he and the Marines were ready to continue island hopping, but got a brief break in the fighting to celebrate Christmas aboard a ship. The girls were so happy to meet him and listen to him tell his story to them. He was very sad being away from his home and his family, but was looking forward to helping to win the war. These soldiers did not get the opportunity to celebrate with their families or get a Christmas tree or presents. They were stuck on a ship. Meanwhile, my pals Connor, Logan, Finn and Mac ended up in a house in New York City in 1944. It was a family celebrating Christmas with 2 empty chairs. They asked where the kids came from, but the boys didn't know how to answer them. They found out that this family had sent their 2 boys off to war and didn't have any information about them. Christmas was not the same this year without their boys, but they were hopeful they would return. Before they ate, they sat down and prayed, and then had some turkey dinner. The boys enjoyed it, and enjoyed talking to this nice family. They could feel the sadness though, as the mom and dad really hoped that their boys would be back soon, healthy and safe. So many families sent their children off to war. Many did not return. Christmas was never the same for those families. This family was just like so many others, trying to make the best of a bad situation. That night, we all ended up together somehow. We talked about how difficult it was for those troops, for those families, and for us. We were sad for them all and wished we could bring them some Christmas joy. That night, we all fell deep asleep, and when we woke up, we were somewhere new. But where? I've got a story from James Smith Browning now. It's entitled The Journal of a Flight Sergeant Radio Specialist. And it's about the war in Iraq during the war, the main war, and a bit of wiki background before we wade into it. The Anglo-Iraqi War was a British-led Allied military campaign in 1941 against the Kingdom of Iraq under Rashid Gailani, who'd seized power in the 1941 Iraqi coup d'etat with assistance from, who else? Germany and Italy. The campaign resulted in the downfall of Gailani's government, the reoccupation of Iraq by the British, and the return to power of the regent of Iraq, Prince Abd al-Ilah, a British ally. So Germany and Italy firstly supported the overthrow of the government of Iraq in 1941. Then the British piled in and returned the ruler to power. And if anyone can recall the late veteran Wilf Shaw's mention of Iraq in his war, then this is the background, though I don't think Wilf actually did any fighting there. I think Churchill just had a word in Gailani's ear and said, "Here, do you realise Wilf Shaw and his mates are over here?" Well, that was all the Iraqis needed, and they buggered off, and it only lasted 30 days. So this story features the Royal Air Force and James Smith Browning, and this is entitled Iraq on Leave. At Christmas, we had a really good time. By now our canteen was well organised and we'd obtained bags of beer and fags from the NAFI. Every man in the billet, drinker and non-drinker, clubbed into a common fund, each an equal amount, and we bought from the canteen beer and cigs, and from the town a few large fruitcakes, sweets, nuts, oranges, cigars, and a few bottles of Hadbar and Iraq. One corner of the billet was cleared by the expedient of squeezing all the beds a bit closer, and in that corner we built a bar. Above the bar we hung a sign which we'd pinched from a hotel in the town, reading, "Inbounds to HBM officers only." That's His Britannic Majesty officers only allowed. There was a competition for the best dressed billet on the station, but although we had spent considerable time and money decorating ours, we did not enter, for ours was intended as a public bar, not a private room, and anyone was welcome at any time. For these hectic days and nights, we'd hardly a quiet moment. The room was always full of visitors, singing songs and swapping stories. We had officers, NCOs and men all having a good time together, and when anyone passed out, we just shoved him in bed to sleep it off. We were the only unfortunate ones, for whereas the main part of the station had time off these days, we, being classed as essential duties, had to carry on in our normal routine throughout, so we had to be, for the main part of the time, sober. All good things must have an end, and ours being at an end, we quickly settled back to normality. After these hectic days at Christmas, I had no intentions of celebrating on Hogmanay, but the lads decided otherwise, saying that as I'd played my part in celebrating Christmas, which is their holiday, they must help the Scotsmen celebrate Near Day. So we got some more beer and then went into town to start off events. Town was only in bounds until 9:30, so our visit there was only in the nature of a preliminary warmer. Arrived back in camp, a little merry, we settled down to celebrate proper and pretty soon had quite a big crowd in the billet. At that time our billet was an assembly room at times of celebration for the more bright or boozy of the crowd. After a while the place was invaded by Scotsmen and eventually I was hauled off to their billet to sing Scots songs for Scots blood. These lads had managed to procure from somewhere a couple of bottles of the real stuff. Whiskey. Funny how a Scotsman smells it out at Hogmanay. And celebrations continued in growing tempo. When 12 o'clock was intimated, the real old was opened and we toasted Scotland and our families and friends there. How we wished we were with them. About 2 a.m, I managed to get away from the party just in time, for I was then only just able to take myself back to my billet and put myself to bed. That finished celebrations for the year, unless of course we decided to celebrate and hold a party on anyone's birthday. It's surprising how often birthdays come up. I write regularly to my father, often in verse in the hope of escaping the attentions of the censors. I felt prompted to write that night, prompted by nostalgic thoughts of home and perhaps the spirit of Hogmanay. So, this takes us to New Year's Eve 1944 with a story from George Hart, an air gunner based in Joshaw in India, in the Royal Air Force. Life in the jungle, serving on a special operations squadron, was something of a boring life because of the tight security. There was nothing in Joshaw to relieve the boredom, so it's hardly surprising that air was let down on New Year's Eve. During an all-ranks party, among other events, someone torched the lavatory basher, and the fire crew, instead of using the extinguishers, threw them on the fire. Among those present at the party was the squadron gunnery leader, a flight lieutenant of Italian origin, complete with kilt, red-headed and sporting an enormous handlebar moustache and very much under the influence. Not being the most popular member of the unit, it was not surprising that the next morning he awoke to find that half of his pride and joy had been shaved off. So much for a mixture of boredom and beer. Well, that was from the BBC People's War website, as this next one is, and this is from Bob Borthwick in Stonehaven, Scotland. At the Hogmanay Ball in the Sergeant's Mess, Wynne and I were dancing the dashing white sergeant. I released my partner too soon, only to see Wynne sliding over the dance floor with her kilt over her head. Years of applying soap flakes to the wooden dance floor at least had the effect of making the transit smooth, if no less embarrassing for both parties. This last track featured on the intro, but here's the full Monty of it. And the story behind it is this. It's from a chap called Dave, I don't know his surname, in Camas, which I think is near Washington, USA. Dave said, "My son's high school marching band once had a Christmas concert, and this is one of the last songs of the concert, the one they'd played in 2 Christmas parades. The concert took place in the school theatre. It starts out with a drum major's whistle. All the kids march from the stage, up the aisles, surrounding the audience. I'm seated in between the aisles, which are now lined with band members. We hear the drum major again, then the band begins playing, and the rest, dear listener, is Christmas. I've got to go now. I've got presents to wrap and Christmas cards to write. Merry Christmas, everybody, and a happy Hogmanay, and thanks so much to each and every one of you for your great support this year. It really has meant so much. I'm Paul Cheall saying cheers and Merry Christmas, and above all, slange, as they say in Scotland.